Hello, welcome to East Hampton Library. Today's Zoom this afternoon is a lecture on the Stonewall National Monument in New York City. And we have with us today Ranger Alex, who is going to show us some photographs from the period, the late 1960s to the present, and discuss this historic monument. And without further ado, I'll turn over this afternoon's lecture to Ranger Alex.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ranger Alex, as was introduced, and I'm one of the park rangers at Stonewall National Monument in Manhattan in Greenwich Village. And so if anyone, I do want to say, like, if anyone has any questions, we are usually pretty conversational with our programs, and this is kind of like one of our general programs, the way we would normally do it, obviously not in person. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to like chat or to talk about them. We like deal with a lot of big picture stuff, so nothing is too strange. I feel like is maybe a good like asterisk before we get started. If there's anything you want to talk about, we're certainly always kind of digging into those topics, so you're more than welcome to ask questions, but I think we should probably keep them until the end just to kind of focus, keep continuity with the screen sharing and everything, so I can keep track of everyone that's going on. But that being said, I feel like a little bit of an intro on like the National Park Service is maybe necessary. We get a lot of different people, and our demographic is usually a little bit different than typical national parks in that we're not necessarily getting the same crowd of people that are always coming to like Yellowstone, for instance, or the Grand Canyon or Yosemite. I feel like those are the types of places that people typically think about when they think about the National Park Service. And while I'm sure they're very beautiful places to go and visit, I am not one of those nature rangers. If you put me out in the wilderness with like the fish and the mountains and the bears, I don't really know what I would do. I'd probably ask the bear if they would like to know a little bit about gay rights or like Eleanor Roosevelt or something, because I'm a history ranger. And so what we do here at Stonewall, a big part of our job, not all park rangers obviously go out into like the mountains and the rafting and rescuing people. Our job here at Stonewall is to kind of sift through the history and to see which pieces are important enough to share with people when they come to visit. And to take care of, obviously, sites like that. So we are just as important as the Statue of Liberty or the Grand Canyon, although obviously I'm a little bit biased. And we actually have a bunch of national parks in Manhattan overall, which we always like to touch on too, because people tend to not realize that there are so many national parks inside New York City. But here are a couple of our sites here. We've got African Burial Ground, Governor's Island, Castle Clinton, Federal Hall, Hamilton Grange, Stonewall, obviously, too, St. Paul's Church, and Grant's Tomb. So there are lots of different sites like ours around the city. Again, less like raccoons and bears and everything in the wilderness, and kind of more history and archaeology kind of things. So why is Stonewall a national monument? Kind of the big part of the story here. Stonewall is actually not the bar where the uprising in 1969 took place, but Stonewall was the site for really this pivotal moment for the LGBTQ civil rights movement, the Stonewall Uprising in June. Actually, the anniversary just passed on June 28th, 1969. It was the 54th anniversary of the uprising, where people inside a gay bar, the Stonewall Inn, rose up and confronted police that were harassing them essentially for having a gay space. And so today it's 7.7 acres of the streets and sidewalks where that uprising took place. Christopher Park, which is what the little picture is of, we're kind of a traffic median, definitely not the sprawling kind of like vistas of like the Grand Canyon. We're kind of wedged in between 7th Avenue and then Christopher Street there. So definitely a different type of national park. And then the original building where the uprising took place, we have the footprint there, and the facade of the building belongs to us. But part of the story here is to kind of understand why Stonewall is important. You kind of need to understand a little bit about what life looked like for LGBTQ people in the United States before Stonewall. And I know we often talk a lot to school groups, so we're usually talking to like younger people who haven't necessarily had the breadth of experience, but definitely I know we'll probably have like a mixed group of people here. So some of us, since this is such present history, it's a story that's still unfolding. It's not necessarily so far removed from a lot of our experiences here. But for LGBTQ people in the United States, in places like New York before Stonewall, it was kind of unfathomable how completely that would impact your life. It would make it impossible for you to get a mortgage, for you to get a job. You could be fired from the federal government for being gay before Stonewall. It was something that could get you sent off to a mental institution, lobotomized. You could be put into a forced marriage, an arranged marriage. Even going to like the wrong place at the wrong time, or, you know, buying a drink for the wrong person at the wrong moment could get you arrested. And it was something that you would be, even gay places for the longest time were considered or serving disorderly people. They used those laws that were like, you can't serve alcohol to people considered disorderly. And they would typically use that to mean homosexual people, gay people. And there were rules about like what clothes you could and couldn't wear. There were a lot of implicit rules about like 3 articles laws, where you had to be wearing at least 3 articles of clothing that matched your assigned gender at birth. So like, for instance, some of our rangers like to use that to talk about how even the park ranger uniform wouldn't necessarily always conform to that, because for some of our rangers that are assigned female at birth, wearing pants wouldn't necessarily have been allowed. Wearing like these unisex outfits, you could get arrested or fined for something like that. So it was something that very much impacted like everybody in all walks of their life, even sometimes not just LGBTQ people, but people who would be like, it would impact cisgender or heterosexual people, and just in terms of like what they would wear, or how they would look, how they would interact with others. You could get followed around for hours by someone trying to buy you a drink at a bar, just to finally accept it and then have it turn around that they were a cop undercover trying to trick you, and that you could be arrested for something like that. So how do you begin, I think, is kind of a big question here. And this is some of the pictures of people getting arrested too there. But how do you begin kind of fighting back against something that overwhelming, that was something that was like so pervasive in all parts of your life and affected everything that you did and were? I think that especially for today, that's a big question that we get asked as park rangers here is like, where do you start kind of dealing with something like that? And so we have some pictures here of the very first organizations, really, some of the earliest organizations in the United States that were advocating for gay civil rights. And so this was groups like the Mattachine Society, which was for gay men, or the Daughters of Bilitis, which were for lesbian women. And they were mostly white people in these groups, mostly cisgender, so as opposed to transgender individuals. And usually they were financially well enough that they didn't necessarily have to worry about this, again, kind of uprooting their entire lives, making them into a position, putting them in a position where, like a lot of people, had to move to Christopher Park, which is where our site is, because they were kicked out of the rest of their lives. They didn't have a lot else going on after they were outed or they came out as gay. That was really like eliminated all of the opportunities that they had. And so these were people who had enough of a stable background to kind of stand out and be the ones pushing this. But when we say pushing this, it's also something that's pretty conservative by the way we think of protests today, right? These were folks who would go out and they would wear their Sunday best and they would comb their hair and they would have these signs like this one says, homosexuals should be judged as individuals. They weren't asking for very much. They were asking to work for the federal government, to have jobs, to be treated just the same as everybody else. They were trying to show the rest of the country, the rest of the world, that they were just regular people, that they were normal, that they could be just as normal as a heterosexual or cisgender person. And so this was very revolutionary for the time. But again, when we think about it today, it's not necessarily the way that protests still necessarily happen, but they were building on the legacy of the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, all of the other social unrest, these social changes, this kind of crucible for change that the 1960s is when this is all going on. So it's coming out of a very big idea kind of moment for these sorts of changes. And you get things like this picture here, which is Julius's, a bar which is right down the street from Stonewall, the sip-in there. And I say sip-in because that was actually kind of a play on the civil rights words, the civil rights language of like having a sit-in somewhere. They decided, this group of people here, they were just a handful of them, just the 4 people in front of the bartender there. They were trying to get a law in New York City overturned that said that, again, you weren't allowed to serve alcohol to disorderly people. And again, this was pretty much universally meant to be that gay people, so you couldn't have a space that was gay. And most of these things are things that happen, like the Stonewall Uprising was a bar, Julius's was a bar. They happen in bars because those are the only semblance of a place that you really had to exist as a community. community. There were no such thing as LGBTQ like community centers. Even having a bookshop was something that was a gay bookshop was something that was pretty revolutionary. And so these bars were still places where you had to, you couldn't face the person sitting in the chair next to you. You had to face the bar counter because otherwise you could be considered cruising, looking for people to pick up. And so they were still pretty rigid places, but they were the only places that folks had. And so they were trying to kind of set this precedent to say, hey, it's unconstitutional of you to decide not to serve me just because I'm gay. And I know today this is definitely kind of tying into a modern story. This is still definitely unfolding. I've been getting news notifications all morning about the Supreme Court case that kind of touches on that same idea about what businesses are allowed to serve and which places are allowed to serve whom. And in this particular question, it is again a question of LGBTQ people. But the Julius's incident where this group of 4 people, they decided that they were going to make a big stink out of it. And the first step to getting this law overturned that said they couldn't be served alcohol in bars was to get a good PR picture, get a good story going. So they took a reporter around to all of these different bars all over the city, and they were trying to find one that was going to not serve them so they could get a good PR photo of it to spread around. And the first bars that they went to, one of them closed their doors. They found out what was going on and they closed their doors ahead of time. The other one also found out what was going on and they decided they were just going to serve them anyway to not have to deal with the whole uproar of it. And so finally they actually went to Julius's, which was a gay bar where they went kind of regularly. They knew the people there and they were like, hey, there are a couple drinks in at this point. They've been doing this bar crawl trying to make a political point and it hasn't worked out yet. They're like, please, we can't keep doing this. Can you just say no? We're going to stage this photo, work with us here. We'll pay your legal fees, but just don't serve us. We want to take a picture of it. And so that's why you've got the picture there with the guy putting his hand over the cup and saying, no, we're not going to do this. And that was the beginning. They were doing things like this. And they actually, Julius's, the sip in there actually helped get that law overturned. So that was the kind of activism that we're looking at. It is really still building off of the ideas of like the civil rights movement, this idea of like civil disobedience. But it's still something that's pretty mild, I think, again, by today's standards. These people are all white men wearing their business best, and they're very orderly, very maintained. And so, again, this is kind of building on the same idea. They're all sort of involved in all of these different movements at the same time. So they have a lot of different influence hearing the language of these other movements. But then you kind of get to Stonewall. And the story at Stonewall, again, kind of deals with a lot of these implicit and explicit rules that governed who could and couldn't be seen in public, what kind of spaces were allowed to be gay. And so like Julius's and like just about every other gay bar in the city, the Stonewall Inn was kind of caveated, kind of had an asterisk, right? Because by the time of the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, they actually had overturned that law that made it illegal to serve alcohol to gay people. But because this was such a contentious business, and because there weren't a lot of people who were seeking out gay businesses, they weren't really trying to make their living, make their mark on the business world by having a chain of gay bars, because they were still considered kind of seedy, kind of an unsavory clientele that you didn't want to deal with. You end up having the mob step in to take over a lot of these places because no one else is willing to do it. They're willing to step in and make a buck off of this situation. So you've got places like the Stonewall Inn that were kind of run by these deals being cut. So for instance, usually the police would come in on a Monday or a Tuesday night when it was less crowded earlier in the night before it got busy. And they would make a big scene out of having this raid where they'd go in and they'd, bother the customers a little bit, but they would take a cut of the money, which was what they were getting in order to leave everything generally alone. And they would leave with their cut of the money. And so these raids, again, happened pretty regularly. The people who went to bars like the Stonewall Inn, they were pretty used to these raids happening. But the night of the uprising, it was a bit of a different story, right? Because the police that came that night were a special vice unit, and they were trying to shut down the Stonewall Inn. They weren't trying to make their money. They weren't trying to get in on the business. They were trying to close the whole thing down. They were trying to make a point and make arrests. So it's a steamy, actually, unbelievably unseasonably steamy night in June of 1969, June 28th. And I like to kind of set the scene here because it really is something that's so tangible, so personal, and so still happening in some places. Honestly, again, like this story is still so impactful to so many people because it's still happening to a lot of us. So you've got June, again, 1969. It's hot. It's this sticky, sweaty day, and you're finally done with your week. You're going to have this nice night out. Maybe you're finally going to make a move on the guy that you've been making eyes at across the bar for a couple of weeks. Maybe your song just came on the jukebox. And that was kind of what made the Stonewall Inn special, actually, was that jukebox, that music, and the fact that these big windows that we have here that we can see in the picture here, they were all boarded up. And that made it different than Julius's or a lot of other gay bars, because it was hidden inside. It wasn't really, being run like the Ritz-Carlton. The mob wasn't really putting a lot of money into making these places nice. So it was boarded up. The windows were all closed up so no one could see inside. There was no air conditioning, obviously. It was pretty dark in there, pretty gross. There was no running water. So they actually had a bit of a problem with hepatitis, because when you got a drink, it would just be kind of dunked in this big container of water before they gave it back to you with everyone else's germs on it, because they weren't really rinsing them off. And then they'd have to dump that big bucket into the toilet at the end of the night, which would overflow. So again, not really setting a great scene here, kind of icky, kind of skeevy, but still this special place because it was somewhere where you could go. And for one night, even maybe you could be just like anyone else. You could have a normal night hanging out with your friends. You could pretend that this wasn't a situation that you had to hide from, that you were having a night that was, again, the same kind of excitement and drama and emotion that was afforded to everybody else at just about any other bar, but you had to go to somewhere like the Stonewall Inn to have that experience, somewhere kind of gross. So you've got people who are in there and they're hanging out again, maybe again, like your song is on, you're having this great moment, but the lights come on and the music shuts off. And you again, you know what this means. You're used to these raids by now. The police come in and they go through the crowd and they pull aside anyone who either doesn't have an ID on them, whose gender presentation doesn't match the ID that they have, or who works for the bar, and by that extent, the mob. And so you've got these folks. And again, I know that this is maybe a little bit, it's hard to frame because it is so personal and so harrowing in some ways. But we like to talk about how the people who were pulled aside for their gender presentation not matching their ID, they would have to they'd sometimes get the novelty of privacy. They'd get to go into the bathroom, or sometimes in front of the crowd. They'd be forced to undress in cases in front of the police officers to prove that their bodies matched the clothes that they were wearing, that they were wearing the right clothing. And so it was something that was, again, pretty routine for a lot of these people to have something so humiliating, so embarrassing, and so personal to happen to them in front of everybody that they knew, really, their entire community. But they were used to it. They were pretty good at turning the other cheek. So you've actually got this group of people who are hanging out in the bar, and as they're being let out, after the police go through the crowd there, they're waiting in the streets for their friends because they're thinking, this happens all the time. Maybe we're gonna boot and rally. We'll find somewhere else to go hang out later. But for now, we're gonna hang out and wait for everyone to come out, and then we can see what we're gonna do with the rest of the night. So they're out there, and as they're bringing out people to be arrested, even these folks who had again just been publicly undressed, they were joking. They were finding humor in the situation. They were making light of it. They were posing with their friends. They were laughing. They were singing to themselves. They were having a good time, or at least as best they could under the circumstances. But there's this tension that's building as folks are leaving the bar, until finally you've got one person, one of the gender non-conforming people, is being brought out to be arrested, and they shout at the crowd that's kind of gathering there of all these people that they know, and they say, "Why don't you guys do something?" And that was the spark, the thing that it took, the one little thing that kind of turned this powder keg of a situation into an explosion. And you've got this group of people who suddenly are out there, and they rise up, they chase the police. Only a few of them, again, because they were used to these folks kind of turning right over. The gay community hasn't always been historically known for being the strongest willed, I guess, or the toughest, the most macho. So they're thinking, these people are just going to roll right over. And so they end up chasing them back into the bar. They've got them on the run, and they hide in there, the police. They barricade themselves in, the few of them, and they're in there shaking in their boots because these gay people are outside lighting pieces of paper on fire and trying to jam it into cracks in the doors to light the whole place up. They unearth a parking meter from the street, and they try to use it as a battering ram to bust in. It bursts into this total chaos. And so the people inside, the police inside, they're seeing all of this go down, and they're not sure what to do about it. This has never happened before. They've never fought back. And so after an extended wait while they're trying to figure out how to get out, because again, this very seedy mafia run bar does not have an emergency exit. There's only one way in or out in the front there. They end up having to send someone out onto the roof to climb over the roofs so that they can jump down and go for backup. But when they finally end up going for backup, and these are some scenes, obviously, of the Stonewall Uprising. I kind of forgot to click through these as we were going through here. But as they're going through the streets here, as backup finally comes, these people who hang out in Christopher Park, who are constantly at the Stonewall Inn, they know these tricky, tangled back streets of the village. I don't know, I'm sure many of us maybe, I know we're maybe kind of in the area, have been through Greenwich Village. We go down there every day and we still sometimes get lost, the rangers down there, because the streets can be so confusing. So you've got these people who know the streets like the back of their hand, chasing these police who aren't normally out here, who don't normally do this route here. They're chasing them through the streets and the police are getting lost, they're getting confused. So you've got these folks who are kicklining and dancing and joking, chasing the police up one street and down the next, until finally at like 4:30 in the morning, they're totally exhausted. All sides, everybody here is totally exhausted, and they end up calling it a day. But after that, this was still a pretty big moment. They have this one night, but then the next morning, people are still kind of humming with this energy, right? Because this had never again happened before. No one had ever stood up. No one had ever fought back. And there's this news throughout the whole area, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, everywhere, all 5 boroughs. It's this idea that something was going down on Christopher Street, that people were fighting back again for the first time, and you needed to show up for it. People needed to be there. There was something to see. And so you've got people handing out signs like this, posting them to telephone poles, calling their friends. And for the next 6 days, you end up having these events, like these pictures here kind of see. I'm going to scroll back so we can look at them for a little bit longer. We don't have a ton of photos, obviously, of that night since it was pretty chaotic that first night there. But for 6 days, that whole weekend, we end up seeing the same sort of thing where people come and they clash with police. They are in the streets, peaceful and violent, protesting, clashing with the police. And they have this moment that no one had ever seen before, this unprecedented moment, this continued resistance. And so you finally get a few people feeling maybe a little bit differently about this, right? Because you've got this older generation of activists, the Mattachine Society, all of those folks from the beginning there who were holding their nice little picket signs with their combed hair, asking, you know, please, can gay people have rights, please and thank you. And so these folks are obviously not really comfortable. They're a little affronted by this idea of these people out in the streets. Again, the folks who were at Stonewall were predominantly a different demographic. They were usually going to be poorer people. Sometimes folks just were the folks who lived in Christopher Park, who had nowhere else to go, who were gay kids who got kicked out of their houses. They were people who were sometimes sex workers, who were Black often and brown, not necessarily white cisgender people like the Mattachine Society had been, or the Daughters of Bilitis had been, where they could go to somewhere else, maybe like Fire Island, and be gay on the weekends in their own places, but then come back on the weekdays to their nice jobs on Wall Street or as lawyers, and to have that kind of separation where they got to only be as gay as they needed to, and to still have these relatively privileged lives. They were worried that these folks kind of going out in the streets and chasing the police and screaming, making a scene, were going to ruin all of the work that they had done already and to kind of make them look bad. These were folks who had a lot to lose that disagreed with this. So they end up writing these signs like on the windows of the Stonewall Inn here, where it says, "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village." They were affronted by this idea that there were people rising up. And so the true test, though, of whose activism kind of worked at the end of the day, whether it was the combed hair picket sign folks, or if it was the screaming queens out in the street, kind of came throughout the next year after Stonewall. Because for the next 12 months, you've got this 6 days that could have easily just been a flash in the pan, right? This moment that kind of fizzled out. But immediately afterwards, you've got all of these folks who are willing to not only have this shiny, sparkly news moment, but also to do the work that kind of required backing that up with action. So for the next year, they're walking the walk as well as talking the talk. They're going to schools, they're doing these letter writing campaigns, they're having sip-ins and sit-ins and all sorts of protests, and they make these new groups like the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance. Before Stonewall, in the earlier part of the 60s, and even leading up to 1968, 1969, there were maybe 50 total LGBTQ organizations across the whole country doing this work for LGBTQ civil rights. And they were typically different groups of the same organizations, like the Mattachine Society in Chicago or the Mattachine Society in New York. And then suddenly, within the year after Stonewall, that 50 different branches of the same groups turns into over 1,500 within that next 12 months of different organizations that crop up for different causes, supporting different groups of people, trying to give voice voice to different ideas, but all of them kind of centered on the same goal of LGBTQ civil rights, of gay liberation. And so 1 year later, you kind of have this big moment to see whether or not Stonewall kind of worked, whether they were disrupting with their peace and quiet, as Madashine and other activists were saying, or if this Stonewall moment was really the thing to trigger a new life into this activist movement. And that comes in the form of the 1970 First Christopher Street Gay Liberation March. And so this happens again on the 12-month, the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. They decide all of these new organizations, they're going to have an annual, like a reminder, a march. They're going to build on the things that they had done before, and they're going to have this march to say, hey, you know, we're here, we're doing this. This was a big moment in our history, and we're going to continue being visible. We're going to commemorate this. And so, you know, these folks are a little bit nervous again, because it's only been a year on at this point. A lot of these things are still illegal. Homosexuality is still classified as a mental illness in the United States. It's still something that can get you into a lot of trouble in a lot of different places, whether it be working again for the federal government or just in terms of like being out on the street and being suspected of cruising or soliciting I guess people in a homosexual way in like a bathroom or whatever. You could still get into a lot of different types of trouble for being gay. So they weren't sure what they were doing. They were a little nervous again, but about a couple hundred people start off in Christopher Park, and they decide that they're going to march the 3.3 miles up to Central Park. They're going to have this moment. And again, they're not sure if a lot of people are going to show up. They're not sure if they're going to be harassed by the police. They get a permit, they're trying to do everything right again, but they're still not sure. And when they look behind them as they're walking their way up towards Central Park, they're looking back to see if everything's all right at the end of the march, end of the line there. And they realize as they're going that eventually they can't see the back of the march anymore because so many people had joined in. As they march those 3 miles, they end up with over 10,000 people marching with them by the time they get to the sheep meadow in Central Park. Folks who had been seeing them from their apartments or who had been out walking their dog and decided they were seeing themselves in this group of people and they wanted to join in. And so it was kind of this first test of whether or not this movement was worth something. And it kind of seemed like, at least at that point, that it was, because you've got this group of people who had come out, who had never been mobilized in this way before. And so over the next several decades, as this movement kind of grows and changes, you've got different activists speaking up for different things. Like in this picture, you've got Marsha P Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who are two of our big characters here at Stonewall. Marcia was involved in the uprising, and Sylvia was important too, both of them actually because of the work that they did in the following years, especially to actually build a movement centered around getting rights for transgender people, which again was something that had never really been considered in the pre-Stonewall activism. This idea that everyone could have a group and could have something like, for instance, a pride flag, a symbol, a meaning. They had a representation in this new movement. They had a voice. And so you've got folks like Sylvia and Marcia creating things like STAR, which was a house specifically to help young folks who were sometimes unhoused or who didn't have resources, who were being arrested for being transgender. At that time, it was originally STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, but they changed it to transgender because we know very well here at Stonewall that language, of course, changes over time. You've also got this movement that's able to mobilize, this whole group of people that's able to mobilize in the 1980s too, and 1990s during the AIDS epidemic. They're able to fight for better drug prices, to fight against the people who are trying to kind of silence the AIDS epidemic, to try to write it off as just a gay issue and to push it under the rug. And they're willing to make a scene. This is like, definitely, I think making a scene is the big key theme for the activism of the post-Stonewall movement. They're willing to go out there and they're willing to have something like this picture here is a federal hall of the die-in that they had, where they just took up space. They closed the streets. They would chain themselves to the stock exchange to try to protest the drug companies that were jacking up prices to treat HIV and AIDS. And so you end up having these. This is actually in front of one of our other Manhattan sites, Federal Hall. That's where this is. It's now a national memorial too, a national monument, just like us. So they're taking up space. They're making these scenes. This picture over here actually is of one of our big symbols here. I'm sure you've seen it a lot thought this month too, it being Pride Month and all, but the rainbow flag is a symbol that this new movement is able to create, because before the rainbow flag existed, we've kind of got a picture of it up here too. You've got the pink triangle that was really the only symbol for the LGBTQ movement. And people didn't really like kind of rallying under that, since it was a symbol that was originally applied to gay people as something derogatory, as something violent and hateful by the Nazis. So they end up making the new rainbow flag. And this one actually is of the mile-long rainbow flag that was displayed at the 25th anniversary march of Stonewall, the 25th Pride March there. And it was made by Gilbert Baker, the person who designed the Pride flag to begin with. And the idea was, again, actually, it was a little bit in spite of one of his friends, his frenemies, who was making the giant AIDS quilt, which was one of the largest, I think is the largest piece of folk art in the United States, at least. And so he was trying to make something on the same scale, the same kind of showy magnitude. But Gilbert Baker decided he was going to make this mile-long pride flag that he then cut up and distributed to different embassies, different dignitaries around the world to kind of, again, make that point. You had this group of people who was able to do this kind of activism, who was mobilized and ready, all these different groups that was born out of the post-Stonewall movement. And they are able to make a lot of progress. We see these groups kind of being responsible for a lot of the changes that we've made towards LGBTQ equality in this country. Like, for instance, in 2015, when it was made legal by Supreme Court case law for gay people to be married all over the country. And so Stonewall too has kind of always been that place. I think, again, we're a very unique park site and that our story is still actively unfolding. It's something that's just as modern as it is history, and all of these things are still connected. So as a national monument, we have to kind of navigate that a lot. These are pictures of folks gathering outside of Stonewall still, even during its time as a national monument. This is a place where people come to either celebrate or to mourn when big things happen in the community. When the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, people came here. We have vigils, we have the Trans Day of Remembrance, we have different ceremonies for those sorts of days and events. And so people come here. It's still a very active kind of community gathering space that belongs to so many different people. I think that's something when people come to us as national parks visitors, those are usually not our bread and butter in terms of who comes to our park. There are folks who have been coming to Christopher Park as a gay meeting space for decades before the National Park Service ever really thought of our little triangle traffic median out there in between Christopher Street and Grove Street and along 7th Avenue, all with our hustle and bustle and our busy little city moment. And so these are some pictures of the park now. There are these sculptures inside, which have had a very contentious history of their own in terms of being kind of seen, taken in different ways at different points in time by the community. They were originally put inside Christopher Park because they wanted something to go in this space even before it was a national monument. At the very beginning of the 1980s, there was this idea that it wasn't gay enough. So we wanted to have something that was permanently a gay reminder about what Christopher Park was and what had happened there. But of course, the people who lived in that neighborhood, which weren't necessarily always the same demographic as people who were hanging out in Christopher Park, they thought these sculptures were initially too gay. So they took them away. They went to Wisconsin actually for a little while, which is of course, notoriously a place where LGBTQ rights are front and center. The Midwest isn't, if they were unpopular in New York, it was kind of a surprise that they thought they would be more popular, I guess, in Wisconsin. But they go out there and they're defaced, but people, again, the community comes together to take care of them. And they're a prompt for conversation again and again. We see them when they return to New York City during the AIDS epidemic. They're considered, instead of being too gay, now they're too sad. They're too solemn. They're not happy enough. There's lots of different questions that we get about them, and we have different people's opinions all of the time on them when they come through for school groups. We actually had a group the other day that said it was kind of comforting actually that they were there, because even if you were in the park by yourself, you were kind of never alone. You always sort of had that community. So we have some interpretive art in our park. If maybe we don't have the mountains and the bears, but we do have our own history obviously here. And that kind of takes us to what it looks like to be a park ranger now. And that's one of my favorite things, I think, to talk about during this program, because again, it is something that when we think of like a national monument or a national memorial, right, there's something that's past about them. They're done and over with. Even like a place like George Washington's house is kind of done and over with history. And the idea of a national monument makes it feel like it's something that we want to kind of put up on a shelf and pretend is done and over with. But that's, again, not really what is happening here at Stonewall. We have a kind of really interesting, unique, and groundbreaking job in terms of what it means to be a park ranger at a place that is a belonging and a home to so many different communities all of the time, kind of overlapping all at once. What does it mean to make a place more accessible as like a public lands space? But now, instead of the way it was before, we have to close it at night. We have to go lock up the gates at night. It's definitely comes with its own share of questions and challenges, but most of what our job does is involved in teaching kids, teaching school groups, trying to make sure that people know that this history is American history and that it is part of the same heritage and same legacy as a place like the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or Yosemite or George Washington or FDR's house or wherever else, that this is real history and it's not just thoughts and feelings and opinions, which is something that we grapple with a lot here. And so I think if there are any questions, I do want to make sure we leave enough time for everyone to get those in. But I know we could go on forever, and we often do when we're in the park here. But if there are any questions or anything, I would love to kind of have those conversations, anything that we didn't talk about that anyone wants to touch on more so going forward. We'd love to talk. But I want to make sure we have enough time for that. So if anyone has any questions, I don't know, I can't see right now. I can exit out of this and pull up the chat screen if there's anything in the chat, or if anyone wants to kind of like unmute and ask anything.
Hey, you're welcome to unmute or type your question in the chat, and we have a thank you from Teresa in there. That's very nice. Thank you.
I wanted to say two things, if possible.
Yeah, of course.
First of all, thank you for including that quote from Stormy Delivery, because there's a lot of lesbian erasure going on, and it's good to see that she's included, especially since she was so non-conforming. And also what you said, what really struck me was what you said, you know, about seeing it as something over and done with, which is, I think, it's something that we really have to fight. And not just because of places like Kenya and Uganda, where being a homosexual is illegal, but also closer to home. I'm European, I'm from Malta. And although it's portrayed, you know, as a paradise in the sense of LGBTQ rights, the mentality is really backward, you know, and what you said at the time of Stonewall, that it was seen as a mental illness, the mentality here is still the same. You know, we still have lesbians, for example, whose families think they are sick. So I think that our history has to be repeated and has to be shared and has to be kept alive, because it's something ongoing that we still have to fight for, you know, and these rights are not something that we can afford to take for granted.
Oh,
and
yeah,
they don't just affect our community, but like you said, if there's someone who doesn't conform to stereotypes, you know, you mentioned those 3 articles of clothing, it affects them as well, because you're judged anyway. So thank you for keeping this part of our history and alive, and for your presentation. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I definitely appreciate that perspective for sure. That's we don't get a lot of visitors from Malta, so it is definitely an important new kind of insight there. And it's very interesting too what you said about Stormy, because we've been doing a lot of research too on our end, and it's so interesting to kind of think about like the mythology of Stonewall, because when we talk about it as an event, we don't really have the same kind of like documented, archived kind of historical, like, I guess, context and material that we would have at a different site, like for instance, like a presidential site or whatever, because most of our recollections and our documents of the events are things that it was obviously a very emotional moment. It was at night, a lot of it. People were sometimes under the influence. So we have a lot of different competing kind of oral histories and different ideas of kind of what happened in that moment. And so it definitely is important to kind of talk about all the different angles. It's interesting that you do bring up Stormy though, because we've kind of had trouble finding whether or not like she was that person. And we think about that in the same ways too with Marsha P Johnson kind of being a person in the same vein of like, Marsha P Johnson is always kind of touted as having thrown the first brick of Stonewall, but then we kind of look at it and we're not really always sure if Marsha, we have her own quote that she wasn't even there when the uprising started, and that she was there were no bricks. We know now that there probably weren't any bricks at Stonewall either. So it definitely is interesting to kind of hear all of like the names and the pieces that kind of come together to make this bigger picture, this bigger story. But thank you so much for that insight. And then I'm going to open the chat here. And so, why was homosexuality considered a mental illness? That's a good question, and I don't know if there's necessarily like a concise answer in terms of like like a clinical answer, I guess. But in terms of like being gender non-conforming or gay, which I think too, that's kind of hard to talk about in a historical perspective, because what we consider to be gender non-conforming or even gay, the language that we use to talk about homosexuality is something that is really modern. Like for instance, like the term homosexual was something that definitely was even itself like a product of really the 20th century to have it mean what we use it for today. But in terms of like a mental illness, I think it probably it would be kind of in the same vein of, and this is like definitely, I'm trying to think of like a good way to kind of explain this in like a less of a, in like the most concise way possible. But I think in terms of a lot of things that we kind of treat as being counter to the power institutions maybe that exist in our society. Right? Because you've got a lot of people who are basing the way that they want the world to run around girls and boys behaving a certain way and performing certain roles. And so if you were not performing those roles, whether it be in being interested in the correct sex or performing your gender, wearing the right clothes and looking the right way, wanting to behave the right way, it was considered a threat to kind of what was normal, what was sane and rational and reasonable in society. And so for you to decide that you were suddenly going to be interested in someone of the same sex, or to perform your gender in a way that was so outside of the norms, that was considered something that was like outlandish and freakish and strange of you. There must be something wrong with you to explain why you weren't being normal like everyone else, why you weren't being like everyone else, if that makes sense. I know that was maybe a little bit of a roughshod answer, but I think that it was a fear of like what it meant to break those norms. And if we accepted them as, oh, we can kind of, not conforming to stereotypical roles, and what if we see people breaking these rules, if the rules that we have about gender and sex are kind of not really grounded in anything tangible, if we can break those rules, what other rules kind of might we start breaking or might we start questioning? So I think it's kind of rooted maybe in that is probably the best answer I could give with the amount of time that we have right now. But Stonewall becoming a national monument, I see that one there. It became a national monument in 2016 after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida, which was the most significant anti-LGBTQ in terms of people who died there. It was the most significant anti-LGBTQ shooting. And that kind of crystallized all of the activism that people had been doing to try to make it a national monument beforehand. There was a lot of groundwork that they were laying, but that was really the big catalyst to make it into to seal the deal, to get the paperwork signed. But with it being a national monument, it very much is a deal of like signing the paperwork. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that. We have a lot of traffic outside here. As a national monument, we actually can be unnational monumented by executive order, because national monuments are created by executive order. So unlike a national park that's created by an act of Congress, if a president decides that they don't want Stonewall, in theory, to be a national monument anymore, that can be something that they do within their own office. So it does have a different status, in a sense, from other national parks. So especially considering how politically contentious we are, that's something that we do consider a lot and think about a lot here. Are there any other questions on here? Or I know I'm kind of scrolling through the chat. Doesn't copy. Oh yes, I think that definitely about like the children's book. This is definitely a children's friendly topic. I think it is a great challenge and a really cool challenge to be able to like think about ways to unpack these big themes, like the kind of question about like why was being gay considered a mental illness? Why was it taboo? To kind of figure out how to talk about these things with kids, and to kind of, before they have all of these preconceptions and these pre-ideas, to kind of figure out the most basic way of having these conversations. Because I think, not to sound like we're infantilizing adults too, but like, you know, everyone kind of can have a lot of emotional baggage coming into these conversations. So being able to like explain it on like a fourth grade level or even younger is a big challenge that we like are constantly working on, how we're talking about these things, and being able to be like, hey, this is just a regular conversation. And it kind of is a lot simpler if you come into it without all the preconceptions and the feelings that a lot of us adults kind of come into these conversations with. But yes, we do need to continue to educate. Thumbs up for sure for that one. And I see some nice messages here. Thank you guys so much for coming. I know some of you have left already, but this is, we always love doing these things, and especially for public libraries too, speaking of books, because they are huge resources to our communities. Absolutely. And being able to do this sort of thing, offer these sorts of programs.
Thank you, Ranger Alex, and thank you everyone for zooming in to the presentation today. And if you enjoy the programs you see through East Hampton Library, you're welcome to visit our webpage, easthamptonlibrary.org, to see our other programs coming up.